and old, and lots of people out there playing and enjoying themselves rather than revising for end of term exams. I'm going to first of all introduce our speaker tonight. Glenn Fine is a distinguished alumnus of Pembroke College. He most recently was Inspector General in the Department of Justice in the United States. He was also the acting Inspector General in the Department of Defense, nominated by President Obama. He was born in 1956 in Melrose Park, Pennsylvania, and at least one row here knows what I'm then going to say. He was a talented basketball player. Indeed, there are some very, very good pictures from earlier today when he was receiving his jersey from this generation's basketball players in Oxford. And he continued to play when he attended Harvard for his first degree. In fact, he played so well that after he graduated in economics in 1979, he had a choice. He could accept the Rhodes Scholarship and come to Oxford, or join this San Antonio Spurs, the great NBA crew that was there at the time. We now know what he did. He chose England over Texas, came to Pembroke to read PPE before returning to Harvard, this time for his law degree. He's had a distinguished law career before being appointed to be Inspector General. His investigations have been notable. I'm not going to steal his thunder because the whole purpose of a talk like this is to hear some of the stories as they actually were played out. And he therefore was there when some of the more momentous investigations in the US were taking place. For any of you who can press the button on Google, you will know that he didn't exactly have the finest working relationship with President Trump. That is one of the accolades that you can add to a long and distinguished career. I can say that even if he can't. And he's then been with the Brookings Institute, publishing learned books and articles, and has agreed to talk to you all tonight about a lifetime in regulatory law and ethics. Can we also welcome Beth to college today? She is a distinguished lawyer in her own right, and it is very nice to be able to welcome a partner into Oxford on a day like this. And thank you for taking the trouble to come and join us with us tonight. Glenn, stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always great to be back to Pembroke College. And I'm happy to talk with you about my career and role in providing oversight and accountability in government. It has been a long career, and I will tell you, how it started and how it progressed. But before I do that, I do have to address the elephant in the room. What's the elephant in the room? Did I really play basketball? I'm not the tallest person. And so I will tell you a story. What happens to me pretty often, which is when I was the acting Inspector General of the Department of Defense, I would meet lots of generals and admirals, and they looked at my resume and they were interested in Harvard, they were interested in Oxford, but they were really interested in the basketball. And they wanted to know whether I really played basketball, was drafted by the NBA. In fact, I was what's called the lead Inspector General for Overseas Contingency Operations, meaning we could provide oversight over the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And I would have to travel to the region to meet with the commanders. And one time the first time I traveled to Kuwait to meet the commander who was in charge of the war in Iraq. And I had staff there. So I would bring the staff to meet the 3-star general. We were sitting in the waiting room for the general to come out. He comes striding out of his office. We all stand up. He walks right past me and goes over to one of my staff members and says, "Welcome to Kuwait, Mr. Fine." This guy was 6'5" tall. He said, my staff member said, "Oh, no, I'm not Mr. Fine." He said, "That's Mr. Fine over there." And the general went like this. "Really? You're Mr. Fine? You're too short. Were you really drafted by the San Antonio Spurs of the NBA?" And I said, "Yes, I was. I was drafted in 1979 in the 10th round. I'm 5'9" tall. Before I started the job as the Inspector General, I was 6'9". It was always a great icebreaker. And in fact, basketball, to some extent, is what led me to Oxford. I won a Rhodes Scholarship, and the day I won that Rhodes Scholarship was a very momentous day for me. Why? Because I would get to study at Oxford for 2 years, and also because in some sense it led me, kind of spurred me to a career in oversight, fighting corruption. My first brush with corruption was the day I won the Rhodes Scholarship. Let me tell you the story. I was the captain of the Harvard basketball team. The biggest game of the season that year was against Boston College, a highly ranked team in the Boston Garden. It's kind of like Mecca, one of the Meccas of basketball in the United States, kind of like Crystal Palace, I would guess. The problem was the same day of that game was the same day of the Rhodes Scholarship final interview. And the final interview was in Baltimore. And I had this game in Boston. What was I going to do? I wanted to compete for the Rhodes Scholarship, but I had an obligation to my teammates. So there was a very wealthy Harvard alumnus who was very interested in basketball, and he decided he was going to fix it. What was he going to do? He sent a private plane down to pick me up at the Baltimore airport after the Rhodes Scholarship interview was over, before the selections were made. Normally you have to stay and wait, but they told me you could leave after your interview was over. And so after my interview was over, I went to the Baltimore airport, private plane, get on the plane, fly to the Boston airport. At the Boston airport, there was a car waiting for me on the tarmac. Drives me through the tunnel to the Boston Garden. I make it in time for the game, 7:20 for a 7:30 game. They're highly favored. They're favored to win by 11 points. We had a great game. It was nip and tuck the whole way. I had the best game I ever had in my career. 19 points, 15 assists, and 8 steals. And you basketball players know that doesn't happen that often. It was back and forth. Finally, at the last minute, they won by 3 points. It was a close game. And then I remembered, oh, the Rhodes Scholarship. I have to call and find out whether I won. So I went into the lobby of the Boston Garden in my uniform, picked up a payphone, and called the number and said, could you please tell me the results? And they said, congratulations, Mr. Fine, you're a Rhodes Scholar. What a day. Best game of my career, Rhodes Scholarship. There was only one problem. The game was fixed. When I was here at Oxford, living in, I think it was Samuel Johnson's room, at least they told me it was Samuel Johnson's room up there. I bet there's a lot of rooms called. Sports Illustrated broke the story that these two mobsters, mafia people, Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke. Has anybody seen the movie Goodfellas?
Yes.
That's Ray Liotta and Robert De Niro played them. These two mobsters had bribed the Boston College players to shave points, meaning to win by less than the spread so that they could bet on the opposing team. And they did. They shaved points. And the second game that was fixed was my game. So I had my best game in a fixed game. And in fact, this friend of mine sent me the Sports Illustrated article, and I remember picking it up at the lodge there. And he wrote on the top of the article, and it was the description of the fix. Hey, Glenn, I guess you played your best game when the other team was in the tank. And sure enough, when I was nominated to be the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, the senator made a speech supporting my nomination and said maybe the fact that he was involved in the notorious corrupt game against Boston College led him to a career in anti-corruption. Not sure whether that's true, but it was very momentous. And I was very fortunate to win the Rhodes Scholarship because I got to come here to Oxford and Pembroke College. By the way, after you win, they ask you, Rhodes College, well, what college you want to be in? And I said, oh, I don't know many of them. How about a co-ed college? Thank goodness Pembroke had just gone co-ed that year. So they put me in Pembroke, and I was very fortunate. I love Pembroke, a smaller college, warm, friendly. I got the great good fortune to be tutored by Ken Mayhew, who's here, economics Don, Zbigniew Pelczynski, Simon Blackburn. I got to meet British students and fellow Rhodes Scholars, travel around Britain, travel around all over the world. I got to play in the Oxford University basketball team. So it was terrific. And I'm so fortunate that I got to go here. Went back to the United States afterwards, went to law school, and decided I wanted to work in the government. My first job as a lawyer was as assistant United States attorney, a prosecutor in Washington, D.C. It is a great job for a junior lawyer. Why? Because you get to go into court. You get a lot of responsibilities at an early stage. Most jobs in government, you get a lot of responsibility in an early stage. In fact, in my job as an AUSA, I did 35 jury trials in 3.5 years. While my colleagues were doing discovery and going over documents in a room, I was in court. And I will never forget the first time I had to go to court. It was like 2 weeks after I'd become an assistant United States attorney. And you go to court, and it was a misdemeanor sentencing case. And I was there, and the defense counsel stands up and argues why the defendant should not be sentenced to incarceration. And then after he's done, the judge looks over in my direction and said, "And what is the position of the United States of America?" And I went like this. Then I realized in this courtroom, I represented the United States of America. And it was a challenge, a responsibility, and it got into my blood, public service. I did it for 3.5 years and then decided to go into private practice. And I was in private practice as a labor lawyer. It was not the same satisfaction, same challenge, and same responsibility. So I decided to go back into government. And I started looking around, and a friend of mine said, "You should interview with the Inspector General of the Department of Justice. I hear he's looking for a head of a special investigations unit." And to be honest, at that time, I did not know what an Inspector General was. Inspectors Generals have sometimes been called the most important public servants you've never heard of. I had never heard of it. And in fact, what do you think of when you think of Inspector General? Well, people have in their idea, I don't know, Inspector Javert from Les Miserables, Inspector Clouseau from the Peter Sellers movie, Inspector Gadget, or even the play by Gogol, The Inspector General, which is actually a very humorous play in that it's a Chekhov play, a Gogol play. It's the story is that there's a small corrupt town in Russia, and they think the Inspector General is coming to the town incognito. And in fact, this peddler is coming to the town, and they think he's the Inspector General, and they ply him with food and drink and gold and women. And he's, oh my God, like, what have I gotten into? And all of a sudden, the real Inspector General shows up, and the real Inspector General sees what's happening, and he fires all the officials of the town and makes the peddler the Inspector General. So that's the story that people know. The reality is a lot different than that. Believe me, you have responsibility and power, but not like that. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of Inspectors General. The history of inspectors is a long history in the military. There's been military Inspector Generals for a long time. In fact, an Inspector General was crucial to the birth of the United States, crucial to the victory of the colonists over the British. Sorry about that. But the colonists had a very ragtag army, no discipline, lack of morale, no training. And they brought an Inspector General over from Prussia, Baron von Steuben, who came to the United States, came to Valley Forge in 1777 when the colonists' army was, Washington's army was on its heels. Von Steuben drilled them, provided discipline, provided morale, and they left Valley Forge as an effective fighting force. In fact, he was with Washington when the British surrendered at Yorktown. He was given an estate in New York in gratitude for this. And there has always been a military Inspector General since then. The Navy has one, the Marines have one, the Army had one. But it's different. It was the Inspector General was a subordinate of the commander, it was the eyes and ears of the commander, reported to the commander. The modern system of Inspectors General happened much later, happened in 1978 as a series of post-Watergate reforms to improve the operation of government, to improve accountability and oversight and checks and balances. And what it was, they established an internal Inspector General in every federal agency to provide oversight of that agency, kind of like internal affairs. And the mission of the Inspector General in all these agencies is to promote the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of the agency, and to promote efficiency and deter waste, fraud, and abuse in the agency. You have the authority and the independence to investigate and oversee anything in the agency. The head of the agency can't stop you. You have auditors, you have evaluators, you have investigators to investigate misconduct, to provide recommendations for improvement. You report as the Inspector General by statute to both the head of the agency and Congress to keep them, the legislature, to keep them both informed about problems in the agency, but neither one can stop you or prevent you from carrying out any investigation, any audit, any review that you want to do. You have the authority to talk to any employee of the agency. You have the authority to subpoena any document anywhere from the agency or elsewhere. Employees have to cooperate with you, or otherwise they can be disciplined or fired. So you have criminal investigators, gun carrying law enforcement agents like FBI agents to do criminal and administrative investigations. You have accountants and auditors to do financial statement audits, to do program reviews, to do all sorts of reviews. Inspectors general in large agencies are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So you are a presidential appointment, but you're supposed to be selected for your nonpartisan qualifications. You're not supposed to be tied to either side. You're apolitical, which is why inspectors general remain in office when administrations change. So I was nominated by President Clinton to be the Inspector General of the Department of Justice in 2000. I was confirmed by the Senate. When the administration changed, I was the only political presidential appointee to stayed throughout the entire Bush administration for 8 years of it, and then remained in the Obama administration. And was typical for inspectors general because you are nonpartisan. The heads of the agencies, as I say, can't direct you. And I worked in my job as the Inspector General of the Department of Justice with 5 attorney generals and the Department of Defense with 3 Secretary of Defenses. And even they, when they first got there, many of them did not understand the authority of the Inspector General and the independence of the Inspector General. So I would brief them as soon as they got there about our independence and what the Inspector General Act required, the statute. And I'll never forget the reaction of one of these attorney generals. When he first got there, I met with him about a week into his tenure. I told him all this, the independence, the Inspector General Act, and he kind of looked at me, scratched his head and said, so you're telling me that I can order around everyone else in the Department of Justice. I can tell them what to do, what not to do. I can tell them what to audit, what to investigate, but I can't tell you. I can't direct you how to do that. And I said, yes, that's what I'm telling you. That's what the Inspector General Act requires. And he looked at me and he said, okay, that's the law. We follow the law around here. And he did. And most of them did, but they didn't really understand it when they first got there. But it is an extremely important role. It has important checks and balances on the government. But I will say, it doesn't make you the most popular person in the agency. When I was in the Department of Defense, I remember one very high level general, one of the top generals in the Department of Defense. Whenever he would see me in the halls of the Pentagon, he would say, hello, Glenn, how you doing? And I would say, fine. Then he would say, am I under investigation yet? And I would say to him, not yet, but the day's not over. And he would laugh and I would laugh. We would go our separate ways, but it shows, the role you play. You're in the department, but you're not controlled by the department. And that's what the beauty of it is. That's what the power of it is. That's what the importance of it is. But like I say, it does not make you the most popular person around. I'll tell you another story. So when I first became the Department of Justice Inspector General in 2000, a senator wanted me to brief him about a report we had just completed. And we will do that when the report's over. We'll go up to the Capitol Hill and brief them. So I took with me my deputy at the time, a guy by the name of Paul Mark, terrific guy, been with me for a long time. He went on, by the way, to be the Inspector General of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And he's very successful. In fact, one of my proudest accomplishments as an IG is that 10 people who worked for me became inspectors general themselves. So that's, if you put your own people in a position for success, that's great. Paul's gone into great success. Anyway, back to the story. Paul and I go up to the Hill, brief a senator, tell him about the report. Here's what the report said. Here's how the findings were. At the end of it, he said, okay, good briefing. He said, but let me tell you what I think of inspectors general. I said, okay. He said, you have to be independent. You're going to do things that people don't like. You're going to do things that I don't like. You're going to do things that the attorney general doesn't like. No one's going to like you. If you think you're going to be liked, don't think that. Do not try and be liked. No one will like you. Do you understand that? No one will like you. Kept saying that and kept pointing at me. And I think Paul, my deputy, I think he had heard enough because he interjected. He said, don't worry about that, Senator. Even I don't like him. And so that was the end of the meeting. The senator cracked up and we left. And while humorous in retrospect, that's true. As an inspector general, you're going to hold people accountable within the agency and you're not going to make everybody happy. You're going to be viewed as too hard or too soft. You're conducting a witch hunt or a whitewash. You're a lap dog or a junkyard dog. Sometimes all in the same case from different sides. So you can't worry about that. Our mantra, we want it to be tough but fair. And that's what we tried to do. And we did do some very important cases. I'll tell you about a few of them in the Department of Justice. So one of the first ones we did was an investigation of the FBI's most damaging spy in FBI history, how he was able to spy for the Russians and the Soviets for 20 years without detection in the FBI. Robert Hanssen. How many of you have heard of Robert Hanssen? A few have had. There's a movie about it called Breach. Anyway, when he was finally discovered, and it's classified how it was discovered, so I won't disclose that, otherwise I'd have to shoot you, which I don't want to do. So they discovered him finally. And when it happened, the FBI said, well, the reason that he was able to evade detection, and by the way, he disclosed some of the United States' most important assets, secrets, the identity of assets, individuals, at least 3 of whom were executed by the Soviets based upon his espionage, all sorts of secrets. So they asked the FBI, well, how was he able to evade detection for 20 years, over 2 decades? The FBI said, well, he worked in counterintelligence. So he was a master spy. He was master at tradecraft. He was wily. He was crafty. They set up an internal review body to look at how this happened. The Attorney General and Congress asked my office, me, to investigate it. How was this happen? And we interviewed him and we looked at their internal security procedures, and we determined that nothing could have been further from the truth that he was a master spy. In fact, he was reckless. He was brazen in what he was doing. He left all sorts of clues and red flags, but the FBI had really weak internal security procedures. Their strategy was trust. Trust is not an effective internal security strategy. I'll give you an example. He would get money from the Soviets and put it in a bank, a block from the FBI in his own name. He was never given a financial disclosure test. He was never given a background test, reinvestigation. He was never given a polygraph test. There were all sorts of red flags. He hacked into the FBI's computer system. And when they found him, he was saying, well, I was just showing his vulnerabilities, and they accepted that. He was a difficult employee. Rather than supervising, they sent him off to another agency, the State Department, where he was left unsupervised and was able to read all sorts of classified documents and disclose them without any supervision. This went on, and it was because of internal security problems. We made recommendations to improve that. They did some of them, but they initially resisted, but eventually they agreed with them. And as an IG, you are not management. You cannot force them to do anything other than respond to your reviews and recommendations. You make recommendations for improvement. All they have to do is say whether they agree or they disagree. They agreed with them and they implemented them. But by the way, fast forward 20 years, and we've had another problem with disclosure of classified information by the airmen allegedly to Shara, who disclosed all sorts of information from classified information from the United States. And that's all, again, because of weak internal security procedures. So that's the benefit of an IG. It's not just to accept the agency's response about how things happen, but to provide independent and aggressive oversight. Another example of that is what happened after 9/11. So I was the IG of the Justice Department before the 9/11 attacks, and then after the 9/11 attacks. So I was there in the Justice Department when the 9/11 attacks occurred. In fact, when the first plane hit the White House, everybody thought it was a small plane. And I got in a car going to a meeting near the White House, and then heard on the radio that there are more planes in the air, and then some of them are coming to Washington, thinking, oh no, White House might be a target. Headed back to the Justice Department and watched the rest of it on TV. After 9/11, the Justice Department changed its focus from not solely, but predominantly a law enforcement agency to also a counterterrorism, counterintelligence agency to prevent this from happening again. So we watched that happen. We actually did a review about whether the FBI and the Department of Justice had clues that they missed, that failed to connect the dots, and we found that there were some. But the one that was, I think, most challenging was after the attacks, the FBI mounted a massive investigation called the Pent Bomb investigation to determine who had conducted the attacks and to prevent anything from happening in the future. It was a very fraught time because people thought there might be follow-on attacks. And they rounded up over 700 immigrants who were in the country illegally and who had committed immigration violations. They rounded them up and they put them in, many of them in a prison or detention facility in Brooklyn. And we started getting complaints about that. As part of the response to 9/11 attacks, the Congress gave the FBI a lot more powers, but they also gave the IG of the Justice Department more authority to hear about and review civil rights and civil liberties complaints. So we started getting a lot of complaints about the treatment of these detainees in a facility in Brooklyn, the Metropolitan Detention Center. We decided to open an investigation of this, and we determined that these detainees were mistreated. They were held incognito for very long periods of time. Lighted cells 24 hours a day. When they were trying to sleep, people would come by and bang on their cells and prevent them from sleeping. They were physically abused. They were threatened. They were not given access to attorneys. They weren't even given access, told what the charges against them were. Now, they had committed immigration violations, but this is not the way normal immigration detainees are treated. So we did a very exhaustive report on this, and initially got a lot of criticism from this. We're under attack. This is a crisis situation. It's a very fraught time. And my response was that may be, but we can both fight terrorism and do it in a way that's consistent with civil rights and civil liberties and our values. So we issued this report. I got some heated comments from certain parts of the Congress, but others eventually said, we agree with this. And the Department of Justice, in fact, said initially, we make no apologies for anything we've done, but they agreed with our recommendations to prevent it from happening in the future. And that's the most important thing, to make positive change. And they did. And I think that was a testament to the power of and the importance of independent oversight in fraught times. We also did reviews of the FBI on misuse of national security letters. They were given authority under the Patriot Act to issue what these so-called national security letters, which are like administrative subpoenas, where they can sweep up all sorts of information, credit card information, bank information, very sensitive information. But they're supposed to do it in accord with certain authorities. And we found that they were not. They were sweeping up too much information. They were handling information in a very cavalier manner. They were actually using it in cases where they shouldn't be using it. And so this was very challenging, very difficult. We issued that report as well. And I'll never forget the FBI director, Robert Mueller, when our report came out, was not happy about what had happened, but he did agree that we had found problems and that they needed to correct them. And he actually was lamenting that the FBI themselves hadn't found it. It had to be the IG who came in to find it. So that was another critically important review in a very fraught time. Now, I'll tell about one more investigation in the Department of Justice and then move on to the Department of Defense. One of the things the Department of Justice does, many people don't know this, is the Bureau of Prisons, which is in the Department of Justice. And there's over 100 prison facilities where they incarcerate more than, at the time, more than 200,000 prisoners. Some low security up to the maximum security, administrative max. And what we found, there's a lot of corruption amongst the guards, bringing in contraband into facilities, all sorts of contraband, drugs, cell phones, weapons. And also there's a very significant amount, unfortunately, of sexual harassment and sexual abuse in prisons. Now, I don't want to make it seem like this is everybody. There are a lot of dedicated people who work in the prisons, but there are, in every large organization, there will be problems. There are some corrupt people, some bad apples, and one of our jobs was to ferret that out. And I'll give you a story about a tragedy that occurred as a result of this. As I said, we have law enforcement agents who investigate criminal misconduct, one of which is sexual abuse in prison. And our agents in Florida found that there was a ring of 5 prison guards in a prison in Tallahassee that were sexually abusing female inmates and were threatening them if they came forward that they would retaliate against them. They did come forward courageously to us. We investigated it. We worked with the prosecutor to bring charges against them, and they were indicted. And so our agents went to arrest the 5 indicted prison guards who had been sexually abusing female inmates. When we went to the prison, investigate 5 of them, we had a team of agents. And we went to arrest the first one, that was fine. Went to arrest the second one, it was fine. When we went to arrest the third one, he came out from behind the reception desk and he had a gym bag over his shoulder. He pulled out from the gym bag a gun and started firing. He shot a prison lieutenant in the stomach, and then he went out to start looking for other people to shoot. And one of our agents was stationed right out the door, and he shot him. And our agent fell, leaned back up, and before this guard could go shoot anybody else, he returned fire, shot and killed the guard. Our agent fell back down and died. So he prevented more damage, but that's, this is a serious, dangerous job that they have. And he, in my view, was a hero. His name was Buddy Sentner. It was June 21st, 2006. And we vow never to forget the sacrifice that he made to uncover corruption and bring corrupt people to justice. So it was a challenge and it was an important job. We did a lot of other things. I did it for 11 years, from 2000 to 2011. And after that amount of time, I decided, you know what, change is good. Change is good for an individual. Change is good for an organization. So I stepped down from the position and I went into private practice again. I was a lawyer at a law firm, big international law firm. And it was an interesting job. I worked with good lawyers. It was lucrative, but it was not the same satisfaction of being involved in the issues of the day, having an impact on government, having an impact on consequential things. Not to say that you don't do consequential things, many consequential things on the private practice, but it just was not the same satisfaction for me. And I guess I'm a recidivist. So they asked me to come back to government. They asked me to come back to the Department of Defense. There was an inspector general at the Department of Defense. He wanted to leave, but he wanted to leave it in somebody's hands who was experienced. So he asked me to come to be the principal deputy inspector general. So I decided to do that. And so 2015, I went there. Within a few months, he announced his resignation. And I became the acting inspector general of the Department of Defense in 2016. Now, I don't have a military background. It's an amazing culture. It was not familiar to me. But being an IG is being an IG. It's the same challenges, the same skills, the same procedures. So I was able to do that. But I will tell you, there are a lot of differences. People always ask me, well, what is the difference between being the IG of the Department of Defense and the IG of the Department of Justice? And there's a lot of differences, but I will say that there are 3 big ones. The first is the size of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense of the United States government is the largest organization in terms of employees of any kind in the world. It has 3.2 million employees if you count active duty, National Guard, civilians, 3.2 million people. I'm told the Chinese army is the second biggest organization in terms of individuals, with 2.3 million. And whenever I would swear in new employees of the Department of Defense, Office of the Inspector General, I would say, and guess what the 3rd biggest organization in the world is? Anybody want to guess?
NHS.
What was that?
NHS.
No. And this is actually a trick question in here in Britain, because I'm not sure you have this organization in Britain. Walmart. Do you have Walmart here? No, you have, what's it called? ASDA? Like there's, yeah, exactly. Well, Walmart has 2.2 million people. It's this big superstore all over the country and all over the world, actually. And I would tell our employees, and what you do overseeing the Department of Defense is a lot more important than what they do at Walmart. Nobody from Walmart has ever been in the audience to like challenge that, but it's what I believe. The Department of Defense has a budget, by the way, of 700, in my time now it's over $800 billion a year. $800 billion a year. If the Department of Defense was a country and you compared its budget to the gross domestic product of every single country on earth, it would be the 21st biggest country in the world, just ahead of Argentina and just behind Saudi Arabia. So while the Department of Justice is big, it's not anything close to the Department of Defense. And in fact, our office at the Department of Justice Inspector General's office had 400 people. At the Department of Defense Inspector's General office, we had 1,800 people in 50 offices all around the country and the world. And 1,800 people sounds like a lot of people to provide oversight, but it is not, given how big the Department of Defense is. So that's the first size of the Department of Defense is a lot bigger. The second thing, the international focus. The Department of Justice is mostly internally. It's kind of like, I guess, MI5, right? MI5 is internal, it's supposed to MI6. But the Department of Justice, it has some international aspect, but the Department of the Defense has operations around the world. And as a result, I had to learn about and understand political issues and foreign relation issues and what's happening all throughout the world. I had to learn the difference, between Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. I had to understand what the situation was in East Africa. You had to learn. And so as a result, I started reading the paper differently. I still, to this day, read the sports sections first. Yeah. But then I would read the international articles because that's what I had to understand. And I had to travel all these places. All over the world because of the operations there that we had to oversee. For example, I was in Iraq, Afghanistan many times, the Middle East, we had operations Kuwait, Kuwait, Bahrain, elsewhere, operations in Stuttgart. In fact, I went to the demilitarized zone in between Korea and South Korea and went right up the line. Have you seen those pictures of people going right up the line between South Korea and North Korea? President Trump did that and walked over the line. When I went there, actually, speaking of that, when I went there, I got a tour and they said, see that line right there? That is the line between North Korea and South Korea. And if you don't step over that line, because that will be an international incident, because North Korean folks were in that building and South Korea. And I said to the colonel was giving me the tour, don't worry about that. That's what I normally tell other people. Don't step over the line. Don't step over the ethical line. So I'm not stepping over that line. Although there was a building, by the way, you can go into. It's half North Korea, half South Korea. So I actually did go into North Korea, but you're allowed to do that. So anyway, that's there's an international focus to the Department of Defense that is just different. And the third thing I will say is they use so many acronyms in the Department of Defense. It is just filled with acronyms. It's like they turn everything into an acronym. And in fact, it was so bad that I had a military aide and I had a schedule, and they would put on the bottom of my schedule the acronym of the day with the explanation. And I felt like I was back in high school learning, vocabulary for the entrance exams. And I'll never forget one time I went and spoke to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and I was giving a briefing, and it was about a year after I was there. And I said to him, and we're coordinating with the MCIOs. He said, MCIO, what's that? I said, you don't know what that is? It's Military Criminal Investigative Organization. He said, oh yeah, I know what that is. Sorry. I went back to my aide and I said, I used an acronym that he didn't know, and he's been there a long time. And they said, well, congratulations, you're now a Department of Defense official. In fact, one I was complaining about all the acronyms they use, and one of my staff said, yeah, we're very BGOA here. I said, BGOA, what is that? What acronym is that? I said, we're very big on acronyms. Turned that into an acronym. So it's really good. So those are the key differences. But like I say, it is similar. We had oversight over the Department of Defense, high-level officials for administrative misconduct, ethics violations, all sorts of things like that. We did audits of the programs of the Department of Defense. We did reviews of contracts the Department of Defense gives, and they give so many contracts out for weapons, for all sorts of things. In an organization that big, there is going to be waste. There is going to be mischarging. There is going to be counterfeit parts put into the weapons system. There's going to be fraud. And that was our responsibility, to oversee that, to review that, to uncover that. And that's what we did. We also did ethics violations. I know some of them sound trivial, but they're not. We would do reviews of travel abuses by top officials of the Department of Defense. The top three, I would actually brief them on what's going to get them in trouble. And give briefings, because part of our job is to prevent them from getting in trouble. So I would brief every new admiral in general. They were part of our class, 1 stars. And I would brief them on the three major, lots of things would get them in trouble with. Here are the three main ones. Travel abuses, meaning going on places they shouldn't be going, and also bringing along spouses they shouldn't be bringing, or also staying, using government resources for their personal travel. So that's it. Travel abuses, misuse of subordinates, using their subordinates for all sorts of things they shouldn't be using, dry cleaning, walking the dog, all sorts of things like that. And then the third one, improper relations with subordinates. We saw a fair amount of that, unfortunately. But we also saw some really serious public corruption. And in fact, there was one case, it's called the Fat Leonard case. This was a guy, he was nicknamed Fat Leonard Glenn Francis, who ran a ship servicing business in Malaysia. And he serviced Department of Defense ships in port all throughout Asia. And what he would do, he would bribe the officers, the contracting officers, to put the ships in his port, to give him contracts, and to overlook the overcharges. He was almost like a KGB agent. He would groom these officers all throughout the 7th Fleet. And he would start with little things. He would start with, I don't know, tickets to a show, or an expensive dinner, or cigars, or a trip to on a weekend to Hong Kong. And when he got his hooks into them, he would do more and more and more. Sometimes actual cash bribes, prostitutes. He knew what your weakness was, and he would groom these people, and then he would rip off the United States government. And in the end, we uncovered this, and there were hundreds of Navy officers throughout the 7th Fleet who had succumbed to this. It's the most damaging and wide-ranging scandal in Navy history. And it's all because people started taking little things, taking little steps, and he had his hooks into you. By the way, we arrested him, and he started cooperating with the government, and he testified against lots of Navy officers. When he was about to be sentenced, he was on home detention, and he had like an ankle bracelet, cut it off, fled the country, eventually caught in Venezuela as he was about to fly to Russia, caught him, returned him to the United States. So these are, serious and wide-ranging investigations. We also did a review. We do financial statement audits. That sounds like we have any accountants in here? I mean, it may sound boring, but it's not. It's very important for a variety of reasons. One, the citizens ought to know where their money is being spent. There ought to be accurate financial statements, but it's more important than that. It's also, when in a financial statement audit, you also check the inventory, the property, the equipment, and that's important to know how many things you had. And believe it or not, the Department of Defense is so big, they didn't even know how many helicopters they had. They didn't know how much spare parts they had. And if they didn't know how many spare parts they had, they were in danger of not having the right amount of spare parts when the aircraft needed it, so the aircraft couldn't fly, or buying so many spare parts, they had massive amounts of them, they have way more than needed. So if you have accurate financial statements, you can cut out waste. You also, by the way, in your financial statement audits, you check this computer security, the systems they use to make the financial statement, which in this day and age is incredibly important to have cybersecurity. So that's another thing we did in the financial statement audit. So let me, I want to also go to the lead inspector general, oversight over the wars all around the world, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was an act passed that the inspectors general of the Department of Defense, state, USAID, and others had to provide oversight and reports on the progress of those wars. And there had to be one inspector general picked called the lead inspector general. The Department of Defense Inspector General, being the biggest one, was picked as the lead inspector general. So I was the lead inspector general over these wars. And what it required us is to go into theater every year and to our staff write quarterly reports on the progress of the wars. But I would go there at least once a year. And every time I went there, I would hear bombs going off in Afghanistan outside the base. And you're in a war zone, you know it. And what our job was to do was to assess the progress of the wars. And so while we would often get rosy assessments from the commanders, from the leaders, our reports disputed that. And we often got information from other people in the military. And we would write reports, and we would write reports on the use of the funds in Afghanistan. In fact, when we went to Afghanistan one year, we went with the president of Afghanistan, Ghani, and he brought in the 3 inspector general, myself, sat me right next to him, and explained what they were doing to stop corruption. And he talked about this for 45 minutes. He was involved with the details. And then he brought us into the cabinet room, and he had all the ministers lined up describing all the efforts they were making. And when I'm sitting there thinking, that's a lot of time to be spending with us. But I think what he was trying to do was to show that they were taking anti-corruption seriously. fortunately didn't really work. And they never really eradicated corruption because it can. There was widespread corruption and it impacted the trust of the people in the government. And as we saw what happened when the coalition forces withdrew, their government collapsed. Part of the reason is because of rampant corruption. In some sense, that's the importance of oversight and oversight and checks and balances. They didn't have that there. We also did review. We also was the lead inspector general in East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, Philippines, Iraq. And we had to do these reports every year. So, and then COVID hit. Probably everyone remembers where you were when it first started, becoming a problem. I'll never forget where I was when I realized how serious COVID was, flying to Afghanistan for one of these annual trips. And COVID was starting to, percolate, but it wasn't the same. We were stopping first in Bahrain and then in Kuwait. Then you get on a military transport to go to Afghanistan. We fly commercial to Kuwait and then to Bahrain. Actually, it was Bahrain first and then Kuwait. When we got to Bahrain, we left the airplane and there were people in hazmat suits taking your temperature. And if you had a fever, you had to go be quarantined. And this wasn't happening where we're in the United States. So, wow, this was serious. And then we were wondering, well, should we keep going? We met with the commander of the Fifth Fleet there. And we decided, no, we'll keep going. We went into Kuwait. And the same thing happened when we got to Kuwait. Hazmat suits. We went to the hotel. There's hardly anybody in the hotel. It was deserted. And then that very day, the State Department said, only essential travel. If it's not essential travel, you can't do it. So I was there with the State Department IG, the USAID IG, myself. We were deciding, well, should we go to Afghanistan? We had all these meetings set up with the ambassador, the commanders, the USAID administrator. We decided, okay, should we go? Well, we hadn't heard of COVID in Afghanistan, but on the other hand, that's probably because they weren't testing for it. We discussed it and eventually we decided, you know what, we should probably go home. We're not necessarily essential travel and I didn't want to expose our staff to COVID. So we went home and basically that was the last trip I took as an IG. Well, why is that? Because as part of the response to the COVID pandemic, there was a legislation that passed that provided $1.9 trillion in relief funds in the United States, $1.9 trillion, huge amount. But they also set up a review committee to oversee the use of all that funds. And it was with 9 inspectors general leading this, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. But they had to pick one inspector general to chair it. And they asked me to do it. And I hesitated at first because I was already the head of the Department of Defense IG's office. But this was a fraught time and they persisted. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. I'll be the chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. So I agreed to do that. It was announced, got a good reaction. 3 days later, I was fired by President Trump. I had been the acting IG for 4.5 years in the Department of Defense. But 3 days after that, he nominated somebody else to replace me. And in the interim, he even removed me as the acting IG and put somebody else in, an IG who had just been confirmed to be the Environmental Protection Agency IG, smaller agency, to be both the EPA IG and the DOD IG. And believe me, it's hard enough to run one office. To do two, particularly one's big as the Department of Defense, it's virtually impossible. But that was it. I was removed. That was not that. And he had actually famously said, no, we don't need the oversight. I'll be the oversight. And I was not told why I was removed, but there it was. That was it for me. And that was I actually stayed a few more weeks, but that was the end of my IG career. On the other hand, when one door closes, another door opens. So as the master was saying, after that, I became a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I teach at Georgetown Law School. I'm actually going to teach next year at Stanford Law School. And I'm writing a book about inspectors general and the need for strengthening and supporting the role of the inspector general. And I have a working title. I guess I like to crowdsource the title. So if you guys come up with a better title, come think about it and let me know afterwards. And I promise to give you an acknowledgement. The title is Guardians of Government, How Inspectors General Keep Government Honest and Accountable. Guardians of Government, How Inspectors General. So think about that. And if you got better titles, I mean, I'm not that great. The publisher probably will have a say in it too, but if you can come up with and the point of it is that we need to support, reform, and strengthen this system of oversight because it is critical to our democracy. We need to do, in my view, we need to do several things. One, we need to make sure we have the right people picked as IGs. We need to make sure, because you have tremendous power and responsibility, and a good IG can do tremendous good, but a irresponsible one can do tremendous damage. And we've had some of that. So one, you need to make sure you have the right ones. You need to have better vetting. Two, you need to be able to answer the question. I get this question a lot. Who's watching the watchdogs? Who's watching an IG? You need to have a better answer to that question. And we need to have we have what's called an integrity committee of IGs, but that needs to be buttressed and funded and supported better so that if there is problems with an IG himself or herself, that's investigated. But we also need to support the good ones. We need to make sure that you can't replace an IG with an acting official who's a political person. And in my view, you shouldn't be able to replace it with an IG who's from another agency to do too, because that creates problems as well. So we need all sorts of reforms, and that's part of what the book is about. But we also need IGs all throughout the government. And in fact, there is not an inspector general for the federal judiciary, for the Supreme Court. And we have been reading, I don't know if you've been reading here, but all the problems, ethics issues in the Supreme Court. I've argued that they need an IG too. They resist. Most entities resist oversight. It's not pleasant to have oversight. The FBI resisted oversight initially in 1978. They said they didn't need an IG. We'll take care of things ourselves. Same with the Department of Justice. They said, we don't need an IG. We're lawyers here. We follow the law. Now you need an IG. Same with the Supreme Court. Same with the federal judiciary. I argued, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about this, that they too should stop resisting an IG, that while it's not pleasant, it can improve operations. And what it can also do is improve trust and confidence in the government, because that's one of the functions of an IG, to provide sunshine, provide transparency, to improve the trust in government. And in fact, the trust in government in the United States, at least, has been diminishing dramatically. It's gone down very significantly. You know which one of the institutions, because they poll this every year. They ask people, what entities do you have a great deal of confidence in, trust in? And most of them are pretty low. Congress, by the way, is at, I don't know, 15%. Supreme Court is going way down. The media is way down. The military is going down some, but it's still at the top. It's in over 50% of trust and confidence in the military. And we once had a consultant talk to us, and explain to us why she thought there was trust and confidence in some institutions, not in others. And she said, and I think this is true. She said, people have trust and confidence in values-based institutions that demonstrate an ability to police themselves. Values-based institutions that demonstrate an ability to police themselves. And in some sense, that's what an IG accomplishes. That's what an IG does. That's why the federal judiciary needs one. That's why we need to strengthen and support and protect IGs, because without it, we have situations like Afghanistan, where the government topples because people don't have trust in it. And I've seen that around the world. And one of the reasons we can have trust in the government, at least we should, is if we can have checks and balances and institutions like IGs that can provide those that oversight and correct problems and not sweep anything under the rug. So that's what I think an IG does, and that's why I think it's important. I'm going to tell one more story, and then I'm going to stop and we'll answer questions. And it is important what an IG does, but let me tell you the story. When I was going to Afghanistan, as I mentioned, you have to fly commercial to the region, then you fly from Kuwait or Qatar into Kabul, and you fly from there to Kabul on a military transport, a big C-130 transport. Often it's a big cargo hold. Sometimes it has all sorts of things in the back. They could hold cars, pickup trucks, munitions. This time, we were going. It was the State Department IG, the USAID, myself, and a few of our staff. And we get on the back of the cargo hold. There are not that many people. A couple of soldiers who were deploying there, but not that crowded. And the pilot of the plane, I think he was a major, Air Force major, goes over to a group of us and says, "Where's the state IG? I want to talk to this." No, I'm sorry. "Where's the DOD IG? I want to talk to the DOD IG." And he goes over to the State Department IG and says, "Are you the Department of Defense Inspector General?" And he said, "No, not me. It's that guy over there." And the pilot walks over to me and says, "Are you the Department of Defense Inspector General?" I said, "Yes, I am." And I'm thinking, okay, what's his beef? Often people have a beef with me, like, oh, we investigated them, investigated our friends. Like, okay, I heard that a fair amount. I said, "Yes, I am the DoD IG." And he says to me, "Well, I really want to have your job." And I looked at him, I said, "Really? Why not?" And he said, "I read all the stuff that you do and all the stuff that lands on your desk. It's unbelievable." And by the way, he didn't use the word stuff. He used another word that begins with S. He says, all the things that land on your desk, the stuff that lands on your desk, and you make everybody happy, you can't please anybody, and everybody's mad at you, and I don't know how you do it." And I looked at him and I said, yeah, it's a tough job, but I think it's, impactful and important, and I enjoy it. And I said, "But I really wouldn't want to have your job. You're flying into a war zone every day. I'm not getting shot at normally. I get to normally go home, sleep in my own bed. I'm not getting shot at every day in a war zone. You are. You have the tough job." And he looked at me and he said, "I guess we're both in the right job then." I said, "Yes, we are." And he said, "We'll get you there safely, sir." And he did. And they're the ones with the tough job. We have a tough job. It's not easy doing what we do. It's very important, but there are others who have a much tougher job. I'm very thankful, very grateful that I chose that option, that I didn't go to the NBA, not that I really actually was going to make it, but it's a 10th round, your chance of making are slim or none. But I have no regrets for 1 second that I came here to Pembroke College, and I'm very thankful to Pembroke College that I went onto a career in the law, and then I went on to work many years, 20 years in the Inspector General community. It was satisfying, it was challenging. I got to see the world. I got to work on some of the most important issues of the day. They are some of the most important public servants you've never heard of. I hope more people hear of them. That's part of the reason I'm writing the book. I hope some of you think about that. Think about a career in public service, either a career in public service or a stint in public service. Many people do it in and out and do something at some point in their careers. It's not the same pay for sure, but you have incredible satisfaction and you have incredible impact on the way our country, your country operates. And I've never regretted it for a second. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
And thank you very much indeed. Can I start off,
Please.
Really by trying to find out whether you've come across anything like the Inspector General anywhere else in the world, particularly anything equivalent in the UK, because I've racked my brain. We've done this in Parliament in standards and in privileges. We've done it with judicial and quasi-judicial inquiries, internal and external audit, but nothing like the Inspector General. And the more you talk about it, the more I realise that critical friends, non-exec directors, and all the usual UK versions of low-key regulatory ethical compliance are nothing by comparison. And so, have you come across anything remotely like it?
No, I think the United States is unique. There are certain oversight entities, auditor generals, for example, or inspectors general in a certain operation, sometimes military, but they do not have the same authority, the same reach, same funding, the same mandate throughout the entire agency to have the independence and the staff to go ferret out problems and to report it and to try and make things better. And so I would often have visits from foreign officials. They would often come to visit with us, and they were amazed at our independence. They were amazed that you didn't get fired for criticizing them. I eventually did get fired, but you have to do the job. I would always tell people, you have to do the job as if you could get fired any day, because you could. It doesn't normally happen. But you do have independence as the IG and wide-ranging authority that I don't think exists in other countries as well. And I think that's one of the strengths of our democracy. It's a very pluralistic, polarized democracy, but we do have these checks and balances. And the IG is one of them. It's not the only one. I mean, I always say to people, there are many checks and balances in the United States. There's obviously the judiciary. There's a free and robust press. There is Government Accountability Office, which is the oversight arm of Congress. There are public interest groups, but IGs are a critical one too. And I think that's really important to our system.
Thank you. Let's open it up to the floor. Yes.
Hi, so my name is Jaya. I'm an American and I'm a lawyer in training, and you clearly have a lot of respect for your country, your position, and people who you've worked with, which I respect and admire to a great deal. But you talk about the government in America and how people have lost trust and confidence in it. And I wonder how we're supposed to have faith in it as Americans, because you see, I mean, Clarence Thomas's corruption is the tip of the iceberg of the problems with the Supreme Court. You've got a politicized judiciary. We've got so many shootings. I mean, we're running towards beating our own record this year. You've got polarized politics. I mean, the Republicans want to get rid of the Department of Education. You've got so many issues in America. And I mean, one of the reasons that I left to study law here is because I felt like I was gasping for air, just drowning under everything that was happening in America. And I don't know how my generation, how we're supposed to find faith, we're supposed to find trust and confidence in the government. And as somebody who's worked to keep the government in check, I thought you might.
Yeah. That's a really important question, and one I completely understand. There certainly are very challenging issues, and we have had concerns, and we've become more polarized, and it is harder to do things. But there are, I think, there's several ways to look at it. We can just say there's no solution to this. It's just going downhill, or we can try and buttress our institutions of oversight. And I do think the pendulum swings. That's my view. That yes, the pendulum swings one way, but it will swing back in other ways. And we need good people to be in there to fighting to do that. Do I think it's the panacea for everything? No, IGs are not a solution to all the problems that you've said, but they are one important solution to corruption and waste in government. And one of the things that I take solace in is we have a system which can make it transparent. We don't sweep it under the rug. We're reading about issues in the Supreme Court. They are going to be pressured and challenged, and change does not come easily. It does not come quickly, but we need to keep fighting. Otherwise, it's going to just get worse and worse. So I would urge you not to give up hope and to do what you can. You can't do everything, but it's helpful. And sometimes, you can do it in one institution. You could do it on a state level. You could do it on a local level. You could do it in various ways. And I think that's important to keep the faith.
Thank you.
We shall ask before we finish if there's a Republican voice in the room as well.
Don't point at me for the Republicans.
No.
I'm Rachel Morgan. I was an investigative journalist. So I would like to know, I mean, obviously you were reactive to certain events like 9/11, for instance. Yeah. But how much do you, in your job, in your various departments, depend on whistleblowers? And what sort of whistleblowing culture was there as a safety net for those staff that were going to be your informants?
Very good question. And whistleblowers are critical to our system. Some of our best cases came from whistleblowers. Fat Leonard case came from whistleblowers, others as well. And we do promote that and encourage it and rely on it. And so, for example, we would have in both the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense, we have whistleblower hotlines. People could report anonymously, and we took everyone seriously. Now, some of them, to be honest, we got like 14,000 in the Department of Justice complaints a year, 15,000 in the Department of Defense. Some of them are what we call the tinfoil hat cases. They're implanting electrodes in my teeth. So one of them, I never forget this one. We have the highway called the New Jersey Turnpike. And somebody got a speeding ticket on the New Jersey Turnpike and contacted us and said, I got a speeding ticket on the New Jersey Turnpike. That I wasn't speeding. You're the Department of Justice. That was not justice. What will you do about it? What we did? We sent them to the New Jersey Turnpike and complained there. So yes, lots of them are silly showing, but there's some very important ones that came through there. We got a whistleblower, for example, who gave us information about faulty science in the FBI laboratory. And he made all sorts of complaints, and there was a seed of truth to it. And our job was to separate the wheat from the chaff. And even if someone has baggage, for example, the whistleblower, a lot of times people blow the whistle when their conduct is under question, sometimes legitimately, but they know what's going on there. They know what the truth is, and they will come forward. You have to take it seriously. We support it, we defend it, and people should not be retaliated against for making good faith disclosures. That's a significant problem. People do get retaliated against, and our job is to try and make them whole.
How do you protect them?
How do you protect them? We make clear to the people who they report to that if they retaliate against this whistleblower who has made this complaint, they will be under investigation. And I would tell the generals and the admirals, One thing that's going to, even if you didn't do the misconduct, what's going to get you trouble is trying to find out who made the complaint and then try and retaliate it. And we had case after case where we investigated and the substantive allegation was untrue. But the subject had retaliated against the person who he thought was the whistleblower. And in fact, in one case, he got the person wrong. It was like not him, but he still retaliated against him. And that's what will get you in trouble. And then this admiral, that was the end of his career, to be honest. So we try and make it clear, don't retaliate, let the process work. It takes longer than you would hope. Sometimes it takes a long time. We tried to do as quickly as we could, but sometimes, honestly, it took too long. Let the process work. And we would tell them, don't retaliate. That's what we try to do.
Yeah.
I'm Paddy, I study politics. You'll hear that I've got an Australian accent, but I love American politics.
Okay.
I'm wondering what protects the Guardians. It seems like IGs are the next frontier for partisan politics. So when you were speaking to Congress people, were they receptive to your arguments about the importance of inspectors general? Or do you think that they say that in those meetings and they say that in the press, but when push comes to shove, they're willing to put their partisan interests first?
So I think they do support IGs, and it often in a nonpartisan way, because we provided information to them. They don't have the staff, the authority, they have the authority, but they don't have the wherewithal to do the detailed investigations that we would do, and also we were in the agency and we knew what was going on. So often we would provide a report and then they would hold a hearing on it. And yes, there were times when the findings of our report didn't align with their agenda, and then they would try and attack us. And I testified, I don't know, over 50 times before Congress. Most of the time, they accepted what we did. And IGs had a reputation for being the truth tellers. And what I tried to do is lay out all the facts and hear the facts. And then here's our analysis. Even if you don't like our analysis, you know what our facts were based on, exhaustive recitation of the facts. And then you could decide how that fits within your agenda. We also had to play it straight down the middle. We would always say, look, when we're coming up to brief you, we'll brief both sides at the same time. We're not trying to please one side or the other, because if you do, as an IG, that's the kiss of death. You've got to make sure you're just being straight down the middle. And sometimes some members, I can't say that all of them took it substantively, but many of them did. And there's a wide variation of it. But by and large, they did support what the IGs do and view them as nonpartisan arbiters of the truth.
Give you an example of where that doesn't work. Commission of Standards in the UK Parliament. The predecessor entitled to the new commissioner, there was a concerted political attack to try and undermine her independent role, which is about the only quasi-judicial role I can think of that even comes close to an Inspector General. And it took the weight of Parliament and a report in the Committee of Standards and resolution of the House in order to support her. And it really did take a lot of hard political graft to make sure that she was supported in the independence of what she was doing. And it's hugely important that the politicians therefore have that buy-in and realise the difference between independence and any external person you can bring in. This is institutional ethical accountability. It's very interesting to hear it. We don't have enough of it in this jurisdiction. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Dan. I work for a charity that works quite closely with local government and the NHS, which sends me nuts. And in my previous career, I worked for some large corporates, and I'm really interested in the difference between effectiveness, efficiency, innovation in for-profit organisations that have all sorts of challenges and issues with the way they work, but they do get stuff done, and they do innovate, and they do improve processes and outcomes, because if they're not successful, they go bust. And that happens in every industry all the time. But organisations like the NHS, local authorities and others don't. And it's become a bit of a standing joke issue in this country that if you're no good in the NHS, the manager, you just get shuffled around, same in local government. And I think, there was an Ofsted challenge in this country about scrutiny. There was the Metropolitan Police that wasn't scrutinised appropriately. And yet people keep getting shuffled around. So I was fascinated coming here to try and learn or hear something about how we can improve accountability in organisations that are always going to be there and can't go bust.
Mm-hmm. So,
and where there's a huge amount of stasis.
Yeah. So, I do think that an internal oversight entity that is funded, that has the authority to make public, one of the things that an IG does is provide transparency. And with transparency and the knowledge that things will be transparent, there is a deterrent effect. I can't tell you how many times people would say, that I've heard this, well, we don't want to do this because we don't want an IG investigation. We don't want to do this because we don't want Glenn Fine looking at us. I mean, that they would say it. And I think my picture was on like dartboards over at the FBI, but there is a deterrent effect to that. And I think that there's a Supreme Court justice, former Supreme Court justice named Louis Brandeis, who said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. That's what an IG does. That's what these entities do. And I'll give you another story. One of the attorney generals I worked with, he was very supportive of IGs. And he got his whole staff there and he said, look, you got to cooperate with the IG. He's making things better. It's helping with continuous improvement, which is what I want to see. You know, going through an IG audit is like going, or investigation is like going to the dentist. It's painful when you're in the dentist chair, but you come out healthier. And I think that's right. And that's why these oversight entities are important. And I like that message. And I think it's important. The tone at the top really matters. It has to be buy-in from the tone at the top. And that was good buy-in. There was only one problem with that. So everybody understood that he supported. But when I was walking in the halls of the Justice Department, here comes the dentist. Here comes the dentist. Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. But there you go. I mean, you have to have this credible internal oversight entity to provide a deterrent effect, but also to, you know, to ensure that the programs are being run honestly and efficiently.
Those, yeah. Far right hand side.
I worked in psychology as a DPhil student, and I worked a little bit in AI analysis, especially terms analysis. So I'm quite struck by how you talk. Mostly seems to speak about the retrospective analysis
Yeah.
you do, right? So something comes forward and we're trying to figure out why this terrible thing happened
Right.
after the fact. Is it also possible and permissible to do some well, looking forward to
Yes.
analysis where for some technologies that might be introduced, let's say, to the Department of Defense, it might not be possible to just check after the fact why the catastrophe emerged. Are you able to say something about structural reforms that would prevent the types of we might see from AI applications across the defense?
Excellent point. Excellent question. And I should have commented on this. Sometimes IGs are viewed as, oh, we're just looking after the fact, retrospective, gotcha, plain gotcha. And we try not to do that. What we want to do, that's not, we have to do that sometimes, but we also try and prevent problems from happening in the future. That's part of the reason I would brief these admirals and generals. This is what's going to get you in trouble. Don't do this. But it's also on a program level. We have a staff that has a lot of experience with a lot of programs. So when you're designing a program, you might want to consider these lessons learned from previous reviews, from previous knowledge, and we try to impart that. Now we have to be careful because we're not management and we don't want to be directing it. We don't want to be saying, okay, if you do this, we're going to give you a pass. We can't audit our own work. In other words, we can't direct how it's going to happen because we're going to have to audit. But what we can do is provide guidance about what, things you should consider, what things have gotten you in problems in the past, what are lessons learned, what internal controls you ought to have while you're designing a program. And we do that, and the best IGs do that. So I think that's very important to have a prospective role as well as a retrospective role. And it's a challenge, but in the fine line to walk, but it's important to do that. So thank you for that. That's a good question.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. This isn't completely related to your work as an IG, but I'm sort of curious about your experience working as a civilian in the Department of Defense, especially because I think, current Secretary of Defense was like a general not very long ago, and there are people who've said not enough civilian control of the Department of Defense of the military. And even if there is civilian control, I think a lot of these civilians who are working there have strong industry ties, which isn't necessarily democratic. So I was wondering, just as an insider, do you think the Department of Defense runs for an insider, I shouldn't say, does it run sufficiently democratically?
So if your the question is like civilian control of the military, that is very important.
Yeah.
And I think generally there should be civilian control of the military. And it generally has been the case. Before General Mattis, who was the former Secretary of Defense, and now the current one, Secretary Austin, was a former general. Before that, there had not been a general leading the Department of Defense since General Marshall. The Marshall Plan, and there has to be a waiver. If a general, wants to serve, an admiral wants to serve, there has to be a waiver. So it's an unusual thing, and I don't think it is a good thing to have constant that because, that's a bedrock principle that we ought to have civilian control of the military. And that, it's sometimes people would be called, the Secretary of Defense called them general. Well, when they're not a general anymore, they're a civilian. So I don't think should be a common thing. Having said that, I will be very frank with you. General Mattis, call him General Mattis, he was fantastic. He was a professional. He was, I think, what the Department of Defense needed. So it depends on the circumstances. And he was an inspiring leader. And I think he did a lot of good. But having said that, I think as a principle, it's very important to have civilian control over the military and not to lapse into we're going to have generals or admirals leading it on a regular basis.
One last question before I can hear the chink of glasses. Yes, very back.
We have had some questions sent previously by the live stream.
Okay.
Someone has asked, what is one reform you feel is currently needed in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and how would it address incarceration broadly in the US?
Yeah, so I would say the one reform needed in the prisons, and it relates to the story I told about, Buddy Sentner. The prisons are, a challenging institution. It's very hard to incarcerate that many people, and it's not an easy job. Having said that, it's not an institution that, like the FBI, should be based on trust. And for the longest time, we recommended to the Bureau of Prisons that they have some sort of search policy for their staff who come into prisons, because most are dedicated, but there'll be some who bring contraband and could undermine the safety and security of prisons. They resisted it. It would take too long. It would hold up changes of shifts. We'd have to pay overtime. And they wouldn't even put it through metal detectors. You go through metal detectors to go on an airplane, to go in a prison. I think that's okay. But as a result, they could bring in like gym bags, coolers, all sorts of things in there. I think we need to have effective internal controls. Not that we, are accusing anybody of anything, but I don't know, I guess it was Ronald Reagan who said, trust but verify that we're not bringing things in the institution. So I think that's very important as a procedural matter. And in terms of incarceration, we incarcerate a lot of people, and we ought to look for alternatives to incarceration when necessary and when feasible. And in fact, the inmate population has been declining. Very expensive, and there are some people who need to be incarcerated, but the question is whether everyone in prison needs to be incarcerated. So I think that's an issue that needs to be looked at on a bipartisan basis, and it actually is being looked at on a bipartisan basis.
Glenn, thank you very much for fascinating insight into a world that has developed far beyond what much of the rest of this continent or indeed the other side of the pond was realized. Very worthwhile. Thank you for coming back to let us hear and some of the detail of that. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to those on live stream who've joined us tonight. This is one of a number of discussions that we have. It's interesting that we tend to get our best audiences for our alumni who come back from the States, but it's probably because they have the more interesting stories to tell. But it's been a fabulous evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Those of you who'd like to join us, there is refreshment at the back.